My own son blocked the doorway of my house with both his arms spread wide and looked me dead in the eye. "Dad, you are not coming in while my wife's parents are here," he said, shoving a crumpled $50 bill against my chest. I stood there on the porch, holding plastic bags from the hardware store, my dirty work boots planted on the exact wooden planks I had laid with my own 2 hands 40 years ago. I looked at the boy I raised, who was now guarding my own front door against me. That is when I realized the son I knew was gone, and the silent war for my home had just begun. Before I tell you exactly how I tore their perfect little world to the ground, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a harsh lesson to family members who mistook your quiet nature for weakness. My name is Lawrence Foster. I am 70 years old, a retired structural engineer, and a man who has always believed that your actions should speak far louder than your words. For 40 years, my late wife Diane and I lived a life of quiet dignity. We built our home from the ground up, literally. I poured the foundation, I framed the walls, and Diane planted the oak trees that now tower over the front yard. We never flaunted what we had. When you work hard for every single penny, you do not feel the need to show it off to strangers. We raised our son Cameron with those same values, or at least I thought we did. 6 months ago, Cameron and his wife Vanessa came to me with a sob story. They said rent prices were crushing them, that they were desperately trying to save for a down payment on their own house, and that they just needed a little help to get on their feet. Diane had passed away 5 years prior, and the house did feel a bit too large and empty for just one old man. Out of the love in my heart, I opened my doors to them. I told them they could stay rent-free so they could save every dime. I gave them the guest rooms. I gave them space. I gave them everything a father should give his child in a time of need. But over those 6 months, the narrative slowly shifted. The temporary stay morphed into a permanent occupation. Vanessa began rearranging the furniture, hiding Diane's photographs in boxes in the attic, and complaining about the smell of sawdust on my clothes when I came up from my basement workshop. I swallowed my pride and kept the peace. I wore my old denim jackets, drove my reliable 15-year-old truck, and let them believe I was just a simple, fixed-income retiree who was lucky to have their youthful energy around the house. They did not know the truth about my finances. They did not know a true value of the estate. And I kept it that way because I wanted Cameron to learn the value of hard work, not wait around for an inheritance. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the illusion completely shattered. I had spent the morning at the local hardware store, buying supplies to fix a leaky pipe in the upstairs bathroom. A bathroom Vanessa complained about daily. The autumn air was crisp, and my clothes smelled of pine lumber and old engine oil. As I pulled my truck into my own driveway, I noticed a sleek, brand-new luxury sedan parked right in front of the walkway. It was a vehicle that belonged in a corporate showroom, not my quiet suburban driveway. I grabbed my plastic bags and walked up the stone path. Before I could even put my key in the lock, the front door swung open. Cameron stood there dressed in a sharp blazer and pressed slacks, looking panicked. He stepped outside, quickly closing the door firmly behind him, and spread his arms across the doorframe. "Dad, stop right there," he said, his voice a frantic, hushed whisper. "You cannot come inside right now." I looked at him, genuinely confused. I shifted the heavy bags in my hands. "Cameron, what are you talking about? I live here. I need to fix the sink." "Vanessa's parents are inside," he hissed, glancing nervously over his shoulder at the closed door. "Gordon and Patricia just flew in from out of town. This is the first time they are seeing the place, and Vanessa wants everything to be absolutely perfect." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline of a very bad joke. "Okay," I replied slowly. "I can go through the kitchen and stay out of their way. I will just go down to the basement." "No, you do not understand." Cameron interrupted, his face flushing with irritation. "You look rough, Dad. Your boots are covered in mud. Your shirt is stained. Gordon is a very important man in the finance world, and Patricia is incredibly particular about social appearances. Vanessa is already stressed out enough trying to impress them. We cannot have you walking through the living room looking like a day laborer." It will humiliate us. The words hung in the crisp autumn air. Humiliate them. My own son standing on the porch I built telling me that the sweat on my brow and the dirt on my boots were an embarrassment. I looked at the tailored blazer he was wearing, a blazer I had secretly paid the credit card bill for when he was supposedly struggling to buy groceries. Before I could process the absolute disrespect of his words, Cameron reached into his pocket. He pulled out a crumpled $50 bill and shoved it firmly against my chest. "Look, just take this," he said, his tone shifting from panicked to condescending. "Go down to that diner you like on Main Street. Have a nice long lunch. Get some coffee. Read the newspaper. Just stay out of the house for about 3 hours until they leave. We can talk about the plumbing later. Please, Dad, just do this for me." He was not asking. He was dismissing me. He was paying me $50 to disappear from my own property so he could play the role of the wealthy homeowner for his elitist in-laws. Any other man might have thrown the bags down. Any other father might have screamed, demanded respect, or physically pushed past his son to claim his rightful place in his own home. I felt the heat of anger rise in my chest, a burning fury that begged to be unleashed. But 40 years of engineering had taught me one fundamental truth. When you find a crack in a foundation, you do not scream at it. You step back, you assess the structural integrity, and you carefully plan the demolition. Instead of yelling, I looked down at the $50 bill pressed against my jacket. I slowly raised my hand and took it from his grasp. I looked up at Cameron. His eyes showed a brief flash of guilt, which was immediately swallowed by overwhelming relief. He thought he had won. He thought I was just a tired old man who would take a bribe and shuffle away into the shadows. "All right, Cameron," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. 3 hours. I turned my back on him. I did not say another word. I walked down the driveway, my heavy work boots crunching against the gravel. I climbed back into my old truck, started the engine, and drove away. The silent adjustment had begun. The diner on Main Street was quiet, smelling of burnt coffee and fried bacon. I slid into a vinyl booth near the back window, placed the $50 bill on the table, and ordered a black coffee. I sat there watching the cars drive by, letting the cold reality of the situation wash over me. For months, I had made excuses for them. I told myself that Vanessa was just particular about her space. I told myself Cameron was just stressed about his career. I had blinded myself to the truth because no parent wants to admit that they raised a child capable of such profound selfishness. Diane and I had worked so hard to build a sanctuary. When the neighborhood was nothing but dirt lots and ambitious dreams, we poured our souls into that property. We saved, we sacrificed, and we never took a single handout. I kept my wealth hidden because I believed that inherited money creates weak men. I wanted Cameron to build his own empire. Instead, he had decided to hijack mine and lock me out of it. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The bitterness matched my mood. As I set the mug down, my cell phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. It was a sharp, persistent buzz. I pulled it out and saw a notification on the screen. It was an automated fraud alert from my primary bank. I frowned, tapping the screen to open the secure banking application. I rarely used my credit cards, preferring to pay for everything in cash or direct transfer. The only credit card that saw regular use was a specific emergency card. 6 months ago, when Cameron and Vanessa first moved in, I had handed Cameron that card. I told him explicitly that it was only to be used for emergency groceries or household supplies if I was not around. I had trusted him blindly. The screen loaded, and my eyes locked onto the pending transaction at the very top of the list. It was a charge for $2,500. I stared at the numbers, making sure my aging eyes were not playing tricks on me. $2,500. The merchant name listed next to the massive charge was a company called La Petite Elegance Catering. My breathing slowed. The puzzle pieces suddenly snapped together with terrifying clarity. Cameron had not just locked me out of the house because my boots were dirty. He had locked me out because he and Vanessa were throwing a massive, extravagant, privately catered luncheon for Gordon and Patricia right inside my dining room. And they were paying for the luxury food, the staff, and the fine wine using my emergency credit card. They were literally using my own money to fund a high society masquerade while simultaneously paying me $50 of my own cash to go sit in a diner like a banished stray dog. A cold, calculated calmness settled over my entire body. The sadness and the shock evaporated completely, replaced by the razor-sharp focus of a man preparing for war. I tapped the screen to call the bank's customer service line. A polite representative answered almost immediately. I verified my identity, confirming my social security number and my passwords. "Sir," the representative said, "we flagged an unusually large transaction on your emergency Visa card. We wanted to confirm if you authorized a payment to a catering company today." I looked out the diner window. I could have canceled it right then and there. I could have frozen the card, driven back to the house, and embarrassed them in front of the catering staff and their wealthy guests. It would have been an explosive, satisfying moment of immediate revenge. But a quick explosion is messy. A controlled demolition is a work of art. "Yes, I authorized it," I told the representative, my voice steady and smooth. "The charge is fine. Please let it process." "Understood, sir," she replied, sounding relieved. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" "Yes, actually," I said, leaning forward in the booth. "I need you to generate a comprehensive, highly detailed statement of every single transaction made on that specific card over the last 6 months. I do not want it mailed to my home address. I need you to securely email the digital copies directly to my lawyer's office." I provided her with the contact information for Stuart, a man who had been my personal attorney and close friend for nearly 3 decades. Stuart was a bulldog in a courtroom, a man who loved nothing more than tearing apart a fraudulent claim. The representative confirmed the request and processed the documents. I hung up the phone and placed it gently on the table next to Cameron's crumpled $50 bill. I was not going to yell. I was not going to argue. I was going to let them spend my money. I was going to let them play house. I was going to let them dig a hole so deep and so legally binding that they would never be able to climb their way out of it. I took another sip of my black coffee. It did not taste bitter anymore. It tasted exactly like victory. They wanted to pretend the house was theirs. I was going to let them have their fantasy right up until the moment I tore the foundation out from under their feet. The sun had long disappeared below the tree line when I finally steered my old truck back onto my street. The pristine luxury sedan was still parked in my driveway, dominating the space like an unwanted monument to arrogance. The catering vans had vanished, but the remnants of their high society gathering were painfully obvious. I sat in the cab of my truck for a long moment, listening to the engine click as it cooled, letting the silence center my mind. I was no longer an angry father. I was an engineer evaluating a compromised structure. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The smell of expensive wine and rich catering food hung heavy in the air, completely erasing the familiar scent of old wood and lemon polish that Diane had loved so much. The living room looked like the aftermath of a careless party. Crystal wine glasses stained with lipstick were abandoned on the mahogany coffee table I had built by hand. Crumpled cloth napkins and half-eaten plates of food lay scattered across the counters. They had treated my home like a rented banquet hall, leaving the mess for someone else to clean. I ignored the debris and made my way toward the staircase. All I wanted was to stand under a hot shower in my own bathroom and wash the bitter taste of the day away. I climbed the wooden steps slowly, the familiar creak of the floorboards offering a small sense of comfort. But as I reached the landing, I stopped completely. Lining the hallway right outside the closed door of the master bedroom sat a row of cheap cardboard boxes. They were hastily packed, the flaps sloppily taped shut. Protruding from the top of one box was the sleeve of my heavy winter coat. Resting on top of another was the framed photograph of Diane that had sat on my nightstand for 5 years. The glass over her smiling face was cracked. The door to the guest bedroom clicked open, and Cameron stepped out into the hallway. He was wearing silk pajamas and holding a half-empty glass of amber liquor. He froze when he saw me standing over the cardboard boxes. For a fraction of a second, I saw pure panic in his eyes, but he quickly puffed out his chest, trying to project a false sense of authority. "Dad, listen," he said, his voice low and tight so he would not wake his wealthy guests. Gordon and Patricia decided to extend their trip. They are going to stay for the entire month. The mattresses in the guest rooms are terrible for Gordon. He has severe lumbar issues. They needed the comfort of the master suite. Vanessa peeked her head out from behind Cameron, wrapping a plush robe around her shoulders. "It is just logical, Lawrence," she whispered. She did not even bother to call me Dad. "They are our guests. We have to be hospitable. You are just one person, and you do not need all that space anyway. We set up a folding cot for you down in the cramped basement den." I looked at the closed door of my master bedroom. That room was the sanctuary where Diane and I had shared our deepest fears and greatest joys. It was the room where she took her last breath while holding my hand. And my son had packed up my entire life into flimsy boxes, handing my sanctuary over to snobbish strangers just to play a pathetic game of pretend. He had reduced 40 years of my life to hallway clutter. I looked down at the cracked glass on my wife's photograph. I looked back up at Cameron. He braced his shoulders, waiting for the explosion. He was ready for me to shout. He was ready for me to turn red in the face and call him an ungrateful fool. He was preparing the exact arguments he would use to tell Vanessa that I was just an unreasonable, stubborn old man. I gave him absolutely nothing. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the oxygen fill my lungs. I bent down, picked up the box holding the broken frame, and looked my son dead in the eye. "A month," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "All right then. The basement it is." The sheer shock on Cameron's face was almost comical. His jaw went slack and he blinked repeatedly, unable to process my calm surrender. He had expected a war, and instead, I had handed him a white flag. He actually smiled, a weak, victorious smirk spreading across his face as he let out a long breath of relief. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully dominated a weak, tired old man. I turned away from him and began carrying my boxes down the narrow wooden stairs into the dark basement. I made 3 trips in total, walking right past my son in complete silence. He watched me with a smug satisfaction, proud of his ability to clear me out of his way. The air down in the basement was drastically cooler, smelling of aged concrete sawdust and forgotten memories. The single overhead bulb flickered as I pulled the chain, casting long, dancing shadows across the cramped den. Vanessa had indeed set up a miserable little folding cot in the corner, throwing a thin blanket over it, as if I were a refugee seeking shelter in my own home. I set my boxes down on the cold floor. I brushed the dust off my hands and looked around the dimly lit space. Cameron truly believed he had banished me to a dungeon. He believed he had stripped me of my territory and locked me away where I could not embarrass his fragile ego. He was an absolute fool. When you build a house from the dirt up, you know every secret it holds. You know which floorboards creak and which walls bear the heaviest loads. You also know exactly where the vital organs of the estate are buried. The basement was not a punishment to me. It was my command center. I walked past the miserable folding cot and pushed aside a rack of heavy winter coats and discarded holiday decorations. Hidden behind the clutter flush against the concrete foundation was a heavy steel door that Cameron had not bothered to open since he was a teenager looking for old comic books. I entered the combination into the keypad and pulled the heavy door open. Inside sat a massive fireproof floor safe bolted directly into the bedrock of the house. I spun the dial, feeling the familiar clicks under my fingertips, and pulled the heavy lever. Inside that safe lay the true power of this estate. There were the original property deeds bearing my name alone. There were 40 years of meticulous financial records proving every penny I had ever earned and saved. And most importantly, there were the master structural blueprints of the entire property and the surrounding neighborhood. By locking me down here in the dark, my son had placed me exactly where I needed to be. I sat down at my old wooden workbench, clicked on a small desk lamp, and unrolled the massive architectural blueprints across the surface. I smoothed out the corners, tracing the lines of the property with my calloused finger. They wanted to sleep in luxury upstairs. They wanted to pretend they owned the kingdom. I was going to let them dream, because down here in the dark, surrounded by concrete and steel, I was going to quietly and methodically orchestrate their absolute ruin. The morning sun barely reached the small window near the ceiling of the basement. I woke up on the thin mattress of the folding cot with a stiff back and a perfectly clear mind. The time for anger had passed. It was now time for execution. I put on a pair of worn-out corduroy pants and a faded gray cardigan that hung loosely on my shoulders. I practiced my posture in the reflection of a dark window pane. I let my shoulders slump. I slowed my steps. I transformed myself from a retired structural engineer into a fragile, confused old man who had lost his grip on reality. It was a role I needed to play to absolute perfection. When I shuffled up the wooden stairs and pushed open the door to the kitchen, the invasion of my home was in full swing. Gordon was sitting at the head of my dining table reading a financial newspaper on his tablet. He wore a crisp golf shirt and an expression of permanent dissatisfaction. Patricia stood by the marble island tapping her manicured fingernails against a porcelain coffee mug. Vanessa and Cameron were nowhere to be seen, likely still asleep in the master suite that I had built for Diane. "Good morning," I mumbled, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor tiles. Patricia let out a heavy sigh, ignoring my greeting entirely. "Gordon, the water pressure in the guest bathroom sink is absolutely dreadful. I cannot properly wash my face with a mere trickle. It is completely unacceptable for a house in this neighborhood." Gordon did not even look up from his screen. "Lawrence," he said, his tone flat and commanding, "go fetch your tools and deal with the guest bathroom plumbing. Patricia cannot be expected to use a defective sink." A younger, prouder man would have told Gordon to pack his bags and get out. A younger man would have reminded Gordon that he was a guest in a home that was paid off decades ago, while Gordon was allegedly hiding from his own bankrupt failures. But I simply nodded. I told him I would get right on it. I shuffled to the hall closet, grabbed my red toolbox, and walked upstairs. I stood in the guest bathroom and looked at the copper pipes beneath the sink. I remembered the exact afternoon I had soldered those joints. It was a hot July day. Diane had brought me a glass of iced tea and wiped the sweat from my forehead. The plumbing was not defective. The aerator just needed a quick scrub to remove some hard water buildup. It was a 3-minute job. I turned the water off, unscrewed the cap, and cleaned the mesh screen. But I did not go back downstairs immediately. I sat on the edge of the bathtub for a full hour, tapping a wrench against the tile floor to make it sound like I was struggling. I let them believe I was a slow, incapable old man who took an hour to fix a simple water flow issue. When I finally came back down, Gordon handed me a slip of paper and a $20 bill. He did not ask me if I was busy. He did not say, "Please." "Take my suit to the dry cleaners on 4th Street, he instructed. "Tell them I need a heavy starch on the collar. And do not lose the receipt, Lawrence. I need that suit for a dinner meeting tomorrow." I took the money, took the suit. I played the obedient servant. I drove my old truck into town, dropped off his pretentious suit, and made a very specific detour. I parked behind a large electronics retailer on the edge of town. I walked to the security and surveillance aisle. I did not buy anything large or obvious. I selected a discrete motion-activated high-definition camera. It was no bigger than a deck of playing cards designed to look like a small black charging block. It had a wireless connection that I could link directly to the secure tablet I kept locked in my basement safe. I paid in cash, placed the small box in my jacket pocket, and drove back to my occupied home. For the rest of the week, I perfected my new persona. I became a ghost in my own hallways. I shuffled when I walked. I asked Cameron to repeat simple instructions. I pretended to lose my train of thought in the middle of sentences. The trap was working flawlessly. The weaker they believed I was, the bolder they became. By Thursday evening, they had stopped hiding their true intentions. I was sitting in a faded armchair in the corner of the living room, holding a book open in my lap. I stared blankly at the pages, pretending to doze off, but my ears were sharply tuned to the conversation happening on the leather sofa just a few feet away. Vanessa was swirling in a glass of red wine, her legs crossed elegantly. She looked at me with an expression of pure disgust. "Look at him," she whispered loudly to her mother. "He has completely checked out. He barely remembers where the kitchen is." Cameron had to remind him to take the trash out twice yesterday. Patricia nodded sympathetically, taking a sip of her own wine. "It is a tragedy, Vanessa. But you have to be practical. You and Cameron are young. You have your whole lives ahead of you. You cannot be expected to play nursemaid to an old man who is clearly suffering from severe cognitive decline. It is not fair to your marriage." I know, Vanessa sighed dramatically. "Cameron and I have been discussing it. There is a lovely facility a few towns over. Pine Haven, I think it is called. They take state assistance. It is secure, the doors are locked, and he would be around professionals who know how to handle people in his condition. A facility. A state-run nursing home where they park the forgotten elderly to stare at walls until their hearts finally stop beating." My daughter-in-law was casually plotting my institutionalization over a glass of Merlot, sitting in the living room I had built, drinking wine bought with my credit card. Gordon chimed in from the kitchen doorway. "It is the responsible thing to do, Vanessa. He is becoming a liability. If he leaves the stove on, the whole property goes up in smoke. You need to protect the asset. Once he is safely relocated to a care center, you and Cameron can really open this place up. Knock down that awful dividing wall, modernize the kitchen, maybe put a pool in the backyard. This estate has enormous potential once the dead weight is removed." I did not move a single muscle. I kept my breathing slow and even. I let my chin rest against my chest, playing the role of the deaf, sleeping old fool. Every word they spoke was a nail in their own coffins. They were so blinded by their greed and their assumptions of my frailty that they did not even bother to lower their voices. They felt completely invincible. Later that night, long after the house had gone completely silent, I put my plan into motion. I slipped out of the basement, my footsteps completely silent on the hardwood floors. I knew exactly where to step to avoid the creaking floorboards. I moved through the dark living room like a shadow. I approached the large oak bookshelf that covered the far wall. The bottom shelves were filled with decorative vases and pretentious art books that Vanessa had purchased to make the room look sophisticated. But the third shelf down still held a few of Diane's old classic novels. They were pushed to the back, ignored and forgotten by the new lords of the manor. I took the small, discreet camera out of my pocket. I nestled it perfectly in the shadows between two thick, hardcover books. I positioned the lens so it had an unobstructed panoramic view of the entire living room, capturing the sofa, the coffee table, and the entrance to the kitchen. It was practically invisible unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. I am an engineer. Precision is my profession. I pulled out my phone and accessed the camera application. I watched the live feed illuminate on my screen. The night vision was crystal clear. The audio receiver was highly sensitive, capable of picking up a whisper from across the room. The motion sensor was active. It would begin recording the moment someone walked into the room, saving every file directly to a secure cloud server that only I had the password to. I smiled in the dark. It was a cold, hard smile. Cameron, Vanessa, Gordon, and Patricia thought they were the architects of my demise. They thought they were building a cage to lock me away in a state facility, but they were wrong. I had just finished building their cage, and they were going to walk right into it of their own free will. I turned around and went back down to my basement, ready to watch them seal their own fate. The basement den was completely silent, except for the low, steady hum of the old water heater in the corner. I sat alone at my heavy wooden workbench with the thick steel door of my floor safe secured firmly behind me. The glowing screen of my tablet was the only source of light in the room, casting a pale blue reflection across my calloused hands. It was 2 a.m. I had spent the last hour reviewing decades of old property tax documents and utility bills, making sure every legal boundary and financial record of my estate was perfectly organized. I was preparing for a storm, but I did not yet know a hurricane was already raging right above my head. Suddenly, the tablet screen flashed. A silent notification appeared in the top right corner of the glass. Motion detected in the living room. My pulse slowed. I reached out and tapped the alert opening the secure surveillance application. The live feed from the camera I had hidden between Diane's classic novels loaded instantly. The high-definition night vision kicked in, painting my living room in crisp, sharp shades of black and white. The audio feed was flawless, picking up the faint sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor. I turned the volume up just enough to hear pressing the tablet closer to my chest, so the sound would not carry through the basement. Gordon paced into the center of the frame. He was not wearing his usual country club attire. He wore a loose undershirt and pajama pants. He held a crystal decanter in his hand, pouring himself a massive glass of my most expensive aged scotch. He did not look like the arrogant titan of high finance he pretended to be during the daylight hours. His shoulders were slumped heavily, his posture was weak, and he looked exhausted. A moment later, Cameron and Vanessa walked into the room. Vanessa wore her expensive silk robe with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Cameron looked nervous, running his hands through his hair and glancing toward the hallway as if he was afraid I might suddenly wake up and appear. He had absolutely nothing to worry about. The old fool was safely locked away in the basement, exactly where they wanted him. Gordon took a long, aggressive swallow of the scotch and slammed the crystal glass down on the mahogany coffee table. "I cannot keep living out of suitcases, Vanessa." He snapped, his voice a harsh, desperate whisper. "Patricia is losing her mind upstairs. She is complaining about the mattress, the neighborhood, the lack of staff. We need a permanent solution, and we need it by the end of the month." Vanessa rushed forward, placing a manicured hand on her father's arm. "I know, Dad. I know we are working on it. You just have to be patient." Gordon let out a bitter, mocking laugh that echoed through the small speaker of my tablet. "Patient," he hissed. "The bank is foreclosing on our estate on Friday, Vanessa. The creditors are freezing my accounts as we speak. My company is completely bankrupt. 30 years of building an empire, and it is entirely gone. We have absolutely nothing left. If my social circle finds out I am ruined, I will be a laughingstock. I cannot afford to rent a luxury apartment. I need this house." I sat frozen in the cold basement. The truth washed over me like a bucket of ice water. Gordon was bankrupt. The wealthy elite financier who treated me like a peasant, who ordered me around my own home to fix sinks and fetch dry cleaning, was drowning in massive, insurmountable debt. And worse, his daughter knew. Cameron stepped further into the frame, shaking his head. "Gordon, that you're moving as fast as we can," he said defensively. "It is not like we have a massive savings account either. You know Vanessa and I are completely broke. We never had a down payment for a house. Moving in here 6 months ago was the only way we could afford to keep up appearances and pay off our credit cards. We are all relying on this property." I felt a cold, heavy knot form deep in my stomach. The entire narrative of the last 6 months had been a fabrication. There was no house fund. There was no temporary stay to get back on their feet. My son and his wife were total financial failures, and they had invited Gordon and Patricia to crash in my home because they were all running from financial ruin. My estate was not a temporary shelter for a young couple saving for their future. It was their designated lifeboat. They were a family of parasites passing themselves off as high society elites. Gordon poured another generous glass of my scotch. "Then we accelerate the timeline," he demanded, pointing a sharp finger at my son. "I spoke to a lawyer friend of mine in the city yesterday. He specializes in aggressive estate management. If we can get a medical professional to sign off on a severe cognitive decline diagnosis, Cameron can file for an emergency conservatorship." Vanessa nodded eagerly, leaning over the coffee table. "We already started laying the groundwork, Dad," she said, with a proud, sinister smile. "We have been telling the neighbors that his mind is going. We told the mailman he wanders around confused and leaves the stove on. We even documented instances of him forgetting things, like yesterday when it took him an hour to fix a simple plumbing issue in the guest bathroom. He's practically a vegetable. The courts will not even question it. I stared at the screen, disgusted by the sheer depth of their manipulation. They had been planting seeds of doubt in the community, poisoning my reputation with the people I had lived next to for decades. Gordon leaned back against the sofa, staring at the ceiling. Once you have conservatorship, you have total legal authority over the asset, he explained smoothly. You transfer the property deed directly into your name. You lock the old man away in that state-run facility we talked about. What is it called? Pine Haven, Vanessa supplied quickly. They take state assistance, so it will not cost us anything out of pocket. Gordon smiled. Exactly. The state will take his meager pension and whatever little savings he has to cover his daily care costs, and we take full possession of the estate. Patricia and I take the master suite permanently. You and Vanessa take the guest wing. We sell his old truck, we clear out that disgusting basement, and we live comfortably without paying a single dime in rent or mortgage. The silence that followed his speech was terrifying. They had just calmly outlined a criminal conspiracy to kidnap me, strip me of my human rights, steal the home I built with my dead wife, and lock me in a sterile room to rot until I died. I held my breath. I stared at the screen, watching my son. This was the moment. This was the defining moment where a son, any son with a single shred of decency, morality, or love would draw the line. I waited for Cameron to say no. I waited for him to defend the father who had put him through college, who had bailed him out of trouble, who had loved him unconditionally, and given him a roof over his head when he was broke. Cameron stared at the floor for a long, agonizing moment. He shifted his weight, looking at his wife and then at his wealthy, bankrupt father-in-law. He took a deep breath. Then he looked up, his expression hardening into something cold, arrogant, and completely unrecognizable. You are right, Cameron said, his voice steady and completely devoid of any remorse. The house is too big for him anyway. He does not appreciate it. He just sits around taking up space and embarrassing us with his dirty clothes. Besides, he has got one foot in the grave anyway. We might as well take what is ours before the state tries to claim it when he passes. He has got one foot in the grave anyway. The words echoed through the tiny speaker of my tablet, piercing the silence of the basement and embedding themselves permanently in my brain. They did not just break my heart. They incinerated it. The boy I had raised was dead. The son who used to sit on my shoulders and watch the stars, the young man I had taught to drive the groom I had proudly toasted at his wedding, none of it was real anymore. He had traded his soul for a free ride, and he was willing to throw his own flesh and blood into a locked ward to get it. I did not turn the tablet off. I watched them raise their glasses and silently toast to their brilliant plan. I watched my son drink my liquor and smile at his wife, celebrating the planned demise of his own father. I pressed the save button on the application. A solid green checkmark appeared on the screen, confirming that the high-definition video and the crystal-clear audio were permanently secured in my encrypted cloud storage. The file was backed up in 3 separate remote locations. It was ironclad, irrefutable evidence of a criminal conspiracy to commit elder abuse and real estate fraud. I set the tablet down on the workbench. I did not cry. I did not shake. I did not feel the urge to scream or march upstairs and confront them. The ultimate betrayal had burned away every ounce of paternal mercy I had left in my body, leaving behind nothing but cold, hard, calculating steel. They wanted to play the game of legal theft. They thought they were dealing with a weak, ignorant old man whose only value was the dirt he stood on. They thought I was just a quiet, retired carpenter who did not understand the modern world. They did not understand that I was an engineer. I spent my entire adult life designing commercial structures that could withstand earthquakes, hurricanes, and devastating external pressure. I knew exactly how to find the critical load-bearing point of their pathetic little conspiracy. I looked at the heavy steel safe in the corner of the room. Inside were documents that Cameron had never bothered to ask about. Documents that revealed the true nature of the ground they were standing on. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought they were the predators and I was the prey. But tomorrow morning I was going to call my lawyer, and I was going to show my son exactly what happens when you try to demolish a building without checking the foundation first. The morning light was pale and cold when I walked into the kitchen. I kept my shoulders hunched and my footsteps slow, dragging my slippers slightly against the hardwood floor. Cameron was sitting at the marble island holding a cup of espresso. He was dressed in a sharp navy suit, looking every bit the successful young professional he desperately wanted his in-laws to believe he was. Vanessa was leaning against the counter next to him, sipping her coffee with a calculated look of concern plastered across her face. As I approached the refrigerator to pour myself a glass of water, Cameron cleared his throat. He reached into his leather briefcase resting on the counter and pulled out a stack of glossy, thick pamphlets. He slid them across the marble surface until they stopped right in front of me. "Dad, sit down for a minute," Cameron said. His voice was dripping with a sickly, manufactured sweetness. It was the exact tone an elementary school teacher might use with a confused child. I pulled out a stool and sat down carefully, making sure my hands trembled just a fraction of an inch as I reached for my water glass. I looked down at the pamphlets. The top one featured a high-definition photograph of a smiling, silver-haired couple playing cards in a sunlit garden. The bold letters across the top read Pine Haven Assisted Living and Memory Care. "We need to have a serious talk, Dad." Cameron continued, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. "Vanessa and I have been extremely worried about you lately. We did not want to say anything, but your memory is slipping. It is getting dangerous." I looked up at him, widening my eyes slightly to project a look of innocent fear. "Dangerous," I repeated, keeping my voice soft and hesitant. "What do you mean, Cameron?" "I am doing just fine." Vanessa stepped forward, placing a hand over mine. Her skin was cold. "Oh, Lawrence, please do not be in denial," she whispered dramatically. "Just yesterday I found the stove left on high heat for 3 hours. The house could have burned down. And on Tuesday, you walked out to the mailbox without your shoes on and just stood there looking lost. The neighbors are starting to ask questions. It was a brilliant, terrifying performance. The stove incident never happened. I had not walked to the mailbox without shoes. They were inventing a fictional history of dementia, building a verbal case file right to my face. If I had been a genuinely vulnerable man, their absolute certainty would have made me question my own sanity. I would have believed that my mind was truly deteriorating. I let my gaze drop back to the glossy brochure. I let out a long, shaky breath, allowing my lower lip to quiver perfectly. "You really think I left the stove on?" I murmured, sounding entirely defeated. "I do not remember doing that." "That is exactly the point," Dad Cameron said, leaning closer. "You do not remember. You are losing your grip on reality, and it is not safe for you to be alone in this massive house. It is too much responsibility for a man in your condition. Pine Haven has around-the-clock medical staff. They have scheduled meals. You would be safe there. You would not have to worry about anything ever again." I stared at the picture of the smiling couple on the brochure. I forced a single tear to well up in the corner of my eye. I reached out with a shaking hand and pulled the pamphlets closer to my chest. "If you really think it is for the best, Cameron," I whispered, staring down at the table, "I just do not want to be a burden to you and Vanessa." Cameron exhaled deeply, a massive sigh of relief escaping his lungs. He exchanged a quick, victorious glance with his wife. He thought he had completely broken me. He thought the psychological warfare had worked flawlessly, and that I was willingly submitting to my own imprisonment. "You are not a burden, Dad," Cameron lied, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "We just want you to be safe. Take those brochures downstairs. Read through them. We will talk about the transition process later this week. There is no rush, but we need to get the paperwork started." I nodded slowly, tucking the glossy papers under my arm. I stood up from the stool, keeping my posture incredibly frail, and shuffled out of the kitchen. I did not look back. I walked down the hallway, opened the heavy wooden door, and descended the stairs into the dark basement. The moment my feet hit the concrete floor at the bottom of the stairs, the trembling stopped. My posture straightened. The frail, confused old man vanished completely, replaced by the sharp, calculating engineer. I tossed the glossy nursing home brochures into a nearby trash can without a second glance. I walked straight to the back of the basement, pushing aside the rack of old winter coats. I entered the combination into the keypad of the heavy steel safe bolted into the foundation. I pulled the heavy door open and reached deep into the bottom shelf. I pulled out a massive, heavy tube of thick cardboard, sealed at both ends with metal caps. I carried the tube to my wooden workbench and snapped on the desk lamp. I popped the metal caps off and slid out a thick roll of heavy age-yellowed parchment paper. I spread the massive architectural blueprints flat across the wooden surface, weighing the corners down with heavy steel wrenches to keep them from rolling back up. These were not just the blueprints for my house. These were the official municipal zoning and structural planning maps for the entire neighborhood, stamped and sealed by the City Planning Commission 25 years ago. I traced my calloused finger over the grid lines until I found my property. My lot was massive, a double parcel that sat directly on the dividing line between the quiet residential suburban streets and the bustling, rapidly expanding downtown commercial district. Cameron thought this house was just a nice half-acre suburban property. He thought the value was entirely tied to the brick-and-mortar structure I had built. He assumed that because we lived quietly, drove old cars, and repaired our own plumbing, the estate was worth maybe $500,000 on a good day. He looked at my dirty work boots and my calloused hands and saw a simple, uneducated blue-collar worker. He had spent his entire life being embarrassed by my profession. When Cameron was a teenager, I offered to teach him how to read a land survey. I offered to take him to the construction sites to show him how to calculate the load-bearing weight of steel beams and how to negotiate with city zoning boards. He refused. He told me that construction was for people who were not smart enough to wear suits. He went to a fancy business school, learned how to use corporate buzzwords, and decided he was vastly superior to the man who paid his tuition. Because of his profound arrogance, Cameron never bothered to look at the legal paperwork for his own childhood home. He never bothered to check the county public records. If he had, he would have discovered the monumental secret Diane and I had been sitting on for a quarter of a century. 25 years ago, the city decided to drastically expand the downtown commercial district. They bought out dozens of homes, knocking them down to build luxury shopping centers, corporate high-rises, and massive parking structures. The city planners drew a hard zoning boundary right at the edge of our street. But I was not just a carpenter. I was a senior structural engineer who understood the complex machinery of city politics and municipal zoning laws. I hired a brilliant legal team, and we fought a quiet, relentless 3-year legal battle against the City Planning Commission. We won. The judge legally grandfathered my specific double lot into the high-density commercial zone. I promised Diane that I would never tear our house down while she was alive. I promised her we would keep the garden and the oak trees and live out our days in peace. But legally, the dirt sitting directly beneath my basement floor was not zoned for residential living. It was the absolute last remaining piece of undeveloped land legally approved for unlimited high-density commercial development in the most lucrative financial district of the entire county. To a family looking for a suburban home, the property was worth $500,000. But to a commercial real estate developer looking to build a 10-story corporate parking garage or a luxury high-rise apartment complex, this dirt was the holy grail. It was worth millions. $3.5 million easily paid entirely in liquid cash. I stared down at the blue ink on the aged parchment. Cameron and Vanessa were bankrupt. Gordon and Patricia were bankrupt. They were scheming to steal a $500,000 house to save themselves from financial ruin, unaware that they were sitting on top of a multi-million-dollar gold mine. And because Cameron believed I was a senile fool, he was about to lose it all. I reached into the top drawer of my workbench and pulled out a small, worn leather address book. I flipped through the alphabetical tabs until I found the name I was looking for. Mike. Mike was not a pleasant man. He was a ruthless, aggressive shark of a commercial real estate developer. 30 years ago, he was a fresh, arrogant kid straight out of college, and I was the senior engineer who taught him how to read structural blueprints and navigate the vicious world of commercial land acquisition. We had remained quietly in touch over the decades. I knew that Mike had been trying to buy commercial land in my specific district for 5 years, completely blocked by the city's strict zoning limits. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I looked at the glossy nursing home brochure sitting in the trash can. My son wanted to declare me incompetent. He wanted to strip me of my human rights, steal the home I built for his mother, and lock me in a sterile room to rot. He had forced my hand. I dialed Mike's private cellular number. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. Lawrence, Mike said, sounding genuinely surprised. To what do I owe the pleasure of a phone call from the best engineer in the county? Mike, I said, my voice cold, sharp, and entirely focused. I need you to cancel whatever meetings you have this afternoon. I am ready to sell the property. I want a completely accelerated commercial closing. No contingencies, no financing delays. I want an all-cash buyout, and I need the demolition permits expedited immediately. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line as the ruthless developer processed the magnitude of what I had just offered him. Lawrence, Mike said, his voice dropping an octave, completely abandoning his casual tone. If you are serious, I can have $3.5 million wired into an escrow account by tomorrow morning. I will have my legal team draw up the commercial transfer documents today. I am completely serious, I replied. Call Stewart, my attorney. I will meet you both at his office at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Do not send any inspectors to the house. I want this done in absolute silence. Consider it done, Mike said. I hung up the phone and placed it gently on top of the blueprints. I looked around the quiet, dimly lit basement. For 40 years, I had protected my son from the harsh realities of the world. I had provided a safe foundation for him to stand on. Now he wanted to use that very foundation to bury me. I rolled the blueprints back up and slid them into the protective cardboard tube. I was going to let him believe his plan was working perfectly. I was going to let him throw his lavish parties, drink my expensive scotch, and pretend he was the master of the estate. Because in less than a month, he was going to wake up and discover that the kingdom he thought he stole had been legally scheduled for total demolition. The afternoon sun beat down on the concrete driveway as I shuffled out the front door. I kept my head bowed and my steps deliberately unsteady, playing the part of the broken old man until I reached the safety of my truck. Inside the house, Gordon and Patricia were loudly complaining about the lack of gourmet catering options in the refrigerator, while Vanessa scrambled to coddle them. Cameron was out running errands, likely buying more expensive wine with my stolen money to impress his bankrupt father-in-law. I climbed into the cab of my truck, turned the key, and drove away without a single person noticing my departure. The moment my tires hit the main road, the artificial tremor in my hands vanished completely. I drove straight downtown toward the financial district. Stewart kept his law firm on the 20th floor of a towering glass and steel building that overlooked the entire city. I walked through the sliding automatic doors wearing my faded denim jacket and scuffed work boots. The receptionist, in her flawless tailored suit, gave me a polite but distinctly dismissive glance until I gave her my name. Her entire demeanor shifted instantly. She stood up and escorted me directly to the grand conference room at the far end of the hallway. Stewart was waiting for me at the head of a massive mahogany table. He wore a crisp charcoal suit, but his tie was loosened and his sleeves were rolled up. We had known each other for nearly 30 years. He was the attorney who had drawn up the original permits and property deeds when Diane and I first built the house. Sitting directly across from him was Mike. Mike had not changed much since he was a brash, ambitious college graduate, eager to conquer the commercial real estate world. He was older now, wearing a custom-tailored suit and a heavy gold watch, but he still had the eyes of a hungry, predatory shark. "Lawrence, it is damn good to see you," Mike said, standing up quickly to shake my hand. "I am sorry about the personal circumstances that brought us here, but I have been waiting for this phone call for 5 long years." I shook his hand firmly and took a seat at the table. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy metal flash drive along with a thick manila envelope. I slid them across the polished wood toward Stewart. "We need to secure my perimeter before we finalize any sale," I said, looking directly at my oldest friend. Stuart opened the envelope and pulled out the thick stack of bank statements. He adjusted his glasses and read through the highlighted line items. His face slowly tightened into a mask of pure, cold legal fury. $28,000 in barely 6 months, Stuart muttered, shaking his head in absolute disgust. Luxury private catering, designer clothing, and high-end electronics, all charged to a credit account designated strictly for household emergencies. Lawrence, this is textbook financial exploitation of an elder. We can bury your son with this evidence alone. I want you to look at the flash drive first, I told him, keeping my voice steady. Stuart plugged the drive into his laptop. He opened the video file I had exported from the hidden camera in my living room. Mike leaned over the table to watch the screen. The high-definition footage played flawlessly, and the audio was crystal clear. The two professional men sat in absolute silence as they watched my son Cameron sit on my sofa drinking my aged scotch and casually agreeing to a plot to lock me in a state-run nursing home so he could steal my estate. They heard him explicitly state that I had one foot in the grave anyway. The silence in the grand conference room was heavy and suffocating. Mike leaned back in his leather chair, exhaling a long, sharp breath. That is ice cold, Lawrence, Mike said, shaking his head slowly. I negotiate with ruthless corporate raiders and cutthroat developers every single day, and that right there is the most cold-blooded thing I have ever witnessed. Your own flesh and blood. Stuart carefully closed the laptop. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles in his cheek twitched. He took off his glasses and looked at me with a fierce, protective anger that only a true friend could muster. Lawrence, I have known Cameron since he was a little boy playing in your front yard, Stuart said, his voice dangerously low. I am going to tear him apart. The moment you give me the signal, I am filing felony fraud charges. I will alert Adult Protective Services regarding the active conspiracy to commit elder abuse, and I will serve them with a 30-day eviction notice so fast their heads will spin. They will not see a single dime of your money, and they will be lucky if they do not end up in a federal penitentiary. Prepare the legal hammer, Stuart, I said, maintaining my absolute composure. But do not strike just yet. Let them throw their grand housewarming party this weekend. Let them invite all of their elite high society friends. I want maximum public exposure when the foundation crumbles. Stuart nodded, a grim, tight smile touching his lips. He understood the assignment perfectly. I turned my attention across the table to Mike. Do you have the paperwork ready? I asked. Mike did not hesitate. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of dense legal contracts. He slid them across the mahogany table, positioning them directly in front of me. Because your specific property is legally zoned for high-density commercial development, we can bypass the entire residential escrow process, Mike explained, leaning forward and tapping the documents with his gold pen. We do not need a standard 30-day closing period. We do not need residential housing inspections or neighborhood association approvals. This is a direct corporate land acquisition. My holding company is buying the dirt beneath your house, not the structure itself. Mike pointed to a specific bolded clause on the second page of the contract. I am wiring $3.5 million in liquid cash directly into an irrevocable trust managed by Stuart. The funds will be cleared and fully accessible to you by tomorrow morning. The moment you sign these papers, the property officially belongs to my corporation. And the demolition permits I asked, tracing the legal lines of the contract with my finger. Already expedited and fully approved by my contacts at the city planning office? Mike answered, a wide, predatory grin spreading across his face. The exact moment the 30-day eviction notice expires, my bulldozers are rolling onto that lot. We are tearing the entire residential structure down to the concrete foundation and breaking ground on a 10-story commercial parking garage. Your son and his wealthy in-laws will be fighting over a house that legally ceases to exist the second your pen hits this paper. I stared down at the crisp white pages. A profound, heavy silence settled over the room. For a brief, fleeting second, the image of Diane standing on our front porch flashed through my mind. I remembered the sunny afternoon we painted the exterior trim. I remembered the dirt on our hands when we planted the oak trees. I remembered the blood, the sweat, and the tears we poured into creating a safe, beautiful haven for our family. But that haven had been corrupted. The boy we built it for had turned it into a weapon to destroy me. Diane would not have wanted me to suffer in silence while parasites drained my life away and erased our legacy. She would have handed me the pen herself. I picked up the heavy brass pen Stuart offered me. I did not let my hand shake. I did not hesitate for another second. I pressed the tip to the paper and signed my name firmly on the dotted line. I flipped to the second page and signed again. I signed the third and the fourth. With every deliberate stroke of the pen, I systematically dismantled the fake kingdom my son had built. "It is done," Stuart said, gathering the signed documents and stamping them heavily with his official notary seal. "The commercial transfer is legally binding. Lawrence, you are officially a very wealthy liquid man, and Cameron is officially trespassing on corporate property." Mike stood up and extended his hand once more. "It is an absolute honor doing business with you, Lawrence. I will have my construction crew prepare the heavy demolition notices. We will keep them entirely quiet until you are ready to drop the bomb." I shook his hand with a firm grip. "Thank you, Mike. Stuart, keep those fraud logs ready to file. When I give the word, I want you to unleash absolute legal hell." "You have my word," Lawrence Stuart promised, his eyes burning with unwavering resolve. "Just give me the signal." I walked out of the towering glass building and stepped back into the bright afternoon sun. The city hummed with vibrant energy around me. People rushed past on the sidewalks, consumed by their own busy lives, completely unaware of the massive shift that had just occurred. I was no longer the helpless, fragile old man waiting for his son to lock him in a cage. I was a man who had just sold the cage right out from under him for $3.5 million. I climbed back into my faded truck and gripped the steering wheel, feeling the warm leather against my palms. Cameron and Vanessa were busy at home planning a lavish catered party to celebrate their stolen inheritance. They were busy plotting my demise, completely unaware that the ground they were standing on had already been sold to a commercial developer. I turned the key in the ignition, listening to the old engine roar to life. The demolition had been scheduled. Now all I had to do was go back to my dark basement and wait for the wrecking ball to swing. The weekend of the grand event arrived with the chaotic energy of a theater production preparing for opening night. I sat on my folding cot in the dim light of the basement, listening to the heavy footsteps echoing across the hardwood floors above me. Delivery trucks had been idling in my driveway since 7 in the morning. I could hear the muffled shouts of catering directors barking orders, the clinking of crystal glasses being unloaded from wooden crates, and the delicate tuning of a string quartet setting up on the back patio. Cameron and Vanessa were throwing the social event of the season. They had billed it to their elite circle of friends as an anniversary and housewarming party, wrapped into one lavish celebration. To the outside world, they were the successful young power couple proudly unveiling their sprawling new suburban estate. To Gordon and Patricia, it was an opportunity to parade their wealthy bankrupt friends through my home, maintaining the absolute illusion of their high society dominance. I slowly climbed the wooden stairs to the kitchen, needing a glass of water and wanting to observe the scale of their delusion. When I pushed the door open, the transformation of my home was staggering. My modest, comfortable kitchen had been converted into a high-end culinary staging area. Private chefs in crisp white coats were busy preparing miniature appetizers, arranging imported cheeses on silver platters, and chilling dozens of bottles of premium champagne. Towering floral arrangements consisting of rare white orchids and imported lilies dominated every table and countertop. Through the large bay windows, I saw a valet parking attendant setting up a podium at the end of my driveway. Cameron was standing on the patio smoking a thick, imported cigar with Gordon. They were both dressed in immaculate, custom-tailored tuxedos, laughing loudly and gesturing toward the oak trees Diane and I had planted 40 years ago. Gordon was pointing at the garden, outlining where he supposedly planned to install a massive heated swimming pool next spring. I stood near the refrigerator, wearing my worn-out denim jeans, a faded flannel shirt, and my scuffed work boots. I looked exactly like what I was, which was a retired working-class man standing in his own kitchen. But to the catering staff rushing past me, I looked like a lost janitor who had wandered through the wrong door. One of the waitstaff, a young man carrying a tray of polished silverware, stopped and looked at me with a confused, polite smile. "Excuse me, sir," the young man said, stepping around me carefully. "The service entrance is around the side of the house. We are trying to keep the main thoroughfare clear for the hosts." Before I could even respond to the young man, I heard the sharp, frantic clicking of high heels striking the floorboards. Vanessa marched into the kitchen holding a silver clipboard. She wore a stunning floor-length emerald evening gown, dripping with expensive jewelry that she had undoubtedly purchased using the fraudulent credit cards bearing my name. When she saw me standing near the refrigerator, the fake elegant smile on her face completely vanished. Her eyes widened in absolute horror, and a dark, ugly shade of red crept up her neck. She grabbed my arm with a surprisingly vicious grip, her manicured nails digging sharply into my flannel sleeve. She did not say a word to the catering staff. She simply smiled tightly, apologizing for the interruption, and dragged me forcefully down the hallway, pulling me into the narrow corridor right outside the basement door where no one could see us. "What exactly do you think you are doing, Lawrence?" Vanessa hissed, her voice vibrating with a barely contained, furious whisper. I looked down at her, keeping my expression completely blank and docile. "I was just coming up to get a glass of cold water," I replied softly, making my voice sound weak and trembling. "It is very warm down there today." Vanessa let go of my arm, brushing her hands off on her gown, as if touching my flannel shirt had physically contaminated her. "You cannot be up here," she spat, her eyes darting nervously toward the foyer, to make sure none of her arriving guests had seen me. "My parents have invited city councilmen, corporate executives, and extremely important investors tonight. Cameron has invited the senior partners from his firm. This is a high-class event. We are celebrating our new home." She looked me up and down, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. "Look at you. You look like a homeless vagrant. You smell like dust and old motor oil. If any of our guests see you walking around the living room looking like some confused, senile day laborer, it will completely ruin the aesthetic of the evening. It will humiliate Cameron, and it will humiliate my father." I let my shoulders slump, sinking deeper into the role of the defeated old man. "I am sorry, Vanessa," I murmured, looking down at my boots. "I did not mean to cause any trouble. I will just stay in the corner of the kitchen. I will stay out of the way." "You most certainly will not stay in the kitchen," she fired back, her voice growing more vicious by the second. "You are strictly forbidden from mingling with our guests. You are forbidden from walking through the hallways. You are not to speak to the caterers. I want you to go down into that basement, and I want you to stay down there until tomorrow morning. Do you understand me, Lawrence? You do not exist tonight." She opened the heavy wooden door leading to the basement stairs and pointed her finger down into the darkness. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I gave her a slow, sad nod and turned my back on her. I began to slowly shuffle down the wooden steps, keeping my head bowed, playing the tragic victim to absolute perfection. But as I reached the middle of the staircase, I heard a sound that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was not the sound of the door simply clicking shut. It was the heavy, distinct metallic scrape of a deadbolt sliding into a strike plate, followed by the sharp turn of a key. I stopped walking. I stood frozen on the steps, bathed in the dim shadows of the basement. I turned around and walked back up the stairs. I reached out and placed my hand on the brass doorknob. I turned it. It was locked solid. Vanessa had not just ordered me to stay out of sight. She and Cameron had actually gone to the hardware store, purchased an exterior-grade deadbolt, installed it on the hallway side of the basement door, and physically locked me inside. They had imprisoned a 70-year-old man in a windowless underground room to ensure their high society lie remained perfectly intact. If a fire had broken out in the kitchen above me, I would have burned alive. If I had suffered a heart attack in the dark, no medical professional could have reached me. They did not care. My safety, my dignity, my very life meant absolutely nothing compared to the flawless execution of their wealthy masquerade. I stood at the top of the stairs, pressing my hand against the cold, solid wood of the locked door. I could hear the muffled sounds of the string quartet beginning to play in the backyard. I could hear the elegant laughter of their wealthy guests echoing through the foyer. I could hear the clinking of expensive champagne glasses, toasting to a beautiful future in a stolen house. A profound, dangerous silence settled over my mind. Any lingering trace of paternal guilt, any tiny shred of hesitation I might have harbored about destroying my son, evaporated in that exact moment. They had crossed the final boundary. They had moved from financial exploitation and emotional abuse into unlawful imprisonment. I slowly descended the stairs, returning to the cold, concrete floor of the basement. I walked over to my heavy wooden workbench and turned on the small desk lamp. They thought they had locked me in a cage. They thought they had trapped an incompetent, frail old fool in the dark to keep him out of their way. But they had made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. You do not lock a master structural engineer inside the very foundation of the house he built with his own 2 hands and expect him to stay there. I reached under the workbench and pulled out my heavy steel toolbox. I opened the metal latches, revealing rows of perfectly organized, pristine tools. I selected a heavy-duty flathead screwdriver and a solid steel hammer. I did not need to break the door down. I did not need to scream or bang my fists against the wood. I had installed that door 40 years ago. I knew exactly which direction the hinge pins faced, and I knew exactly how to dismantle the entire frame from the inside without making a single sound. But I was not going to do it yet. I looked at my watch. It was only 6 in the evening. The party was just beginning. The guests were still arriving, handing over expensive bottles of wine and lavish housewarming gifts. Gordon was likely just starting to tell his fabricated stories of real estate conquests. Cameron was probably soaking in the praise of his corporate bosses, pretending to be the master of his domain. I needed to give them Tim. I needed to let the arrogance fill the room to the absolute brim. I needed to wait for the exact moment of maximum public exposure when the spotlight was shining brightest on their fraudulent faces. I walked over to the far corner of the basement, where a heavy black garment bag hung suspended from an exposed copper pipe. I unzipped the thick canvas, slowly revealing the contents inside. It was a custom-tailored jet black suit made of pure Italian wool. I had purchased it years ago for special formal occasions, but had rarely worn it. Beside it hung a crisp white dress shirt and a silver silk tie. Sitting in a polished wooden box on the shelf above were my dress shoes, shined to a flawless mirror finish. Vanessa told me I was forbidden from mingling because my clothes were an embarrassment. She told me I looked like a vagrant. She wanted me to remain a dirty, hidden secret in the dark. I slowly unbuttoned my faded flannel shirt and let it drop to the concrete floor. I kicked off my scuffed, heavy work boots. I spent the next hour meticulously grooming myself in the small basement utility mirror. I washed the dust from my hands and face. I combed my silver hair back perfectly. I dressed in the crisp white shirt, tying the silver silk knot with absolute precision. I slipped on the custom-tailored trousers and the heavy wool jacket, adjusting the lapels until they sat flawlessly against my chest. When I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw the meek, defeated old man who had allowed his son to push him around. I saw the wealthy, ruthless architect of their impending destruction. I looked like a man who had $3.5 million sitting in an offshore trust. I looked like a man holding a detonator. I sat down in the wooden chair next to my workbench, listening to the muffled sounds of the grand celebration above me. I listened to the footsteps tapping against the floorboards. I waited in the shadows, perfectly dressed, perfectly calm, and perfectly lethal. The housewarming party was in full swing, but the guests had no idea they were actually attending a demolition. And I was going to be the one to bring the house down. The heavy bass of the string quartet echoed through the floorboards above my head. I sat in the darkness of the basement, breathing in the scent of aged concrete and the faint, crisp aroma of my Italian wool suit. Above me, 80 of the city's most elite socialites were walking across the very beams I had hoisted into place 40 years ago. They were sipping expensive champagne, and admiring the architecture, completely unaware that the architect was currently locked beneath their feet. Vanessa had turned the key in that deadbolt with such satisfying finality. She truly believed a piece of brass hardware from a local supply store was enough to contain a man who had spent his entire life mastering structural physics. She thought of a door as an absolute barrier. An engineer thinks of a door as a simple mechanism of hinges and weight distribution. I stood up from my wooden chair, smoothing the lapels of my dark suit. The fabric felt foreign but empowering against my skin. For so long, I had dressed in faded flannel and scuffed boots to make them comfortable to play the role of the humble old carpenter they so desperately wanted me to be. But the man wearing this suit was no longer a victim. He was an executioner. I walked over to the heavy toolbox resting on my workbench. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I did not need them. I knew the placement of every tool by heart. I reached into the top compartment and pulled out a solid steel flathead screwdriver and a heavy rubber mallet. I walked quietly up the wooden stairs, my polished dress shoes making absolutely no sound on the familiar treads. I stopped at the top landing. Only 2 inches of solid oak separated me from the hallway, where catering staff were rushing back and forth carrying silver trays of appetizers. I could hear their muffled voices. I could hear the clinking of glasses. The deadbolt Vanessa had installed was heavy-duty, designed to withstand a massive amount of blunt force from the outside. If I had tried to kick the door down, it would have splintered the frame, caused a massive scene, and likely required multiple attempts. It would have made me look like a crazy old man having a violent episode, but I was on the inside. And on the inside, the hinge pins were completely exposed. I slid the flat edge of the screwdriver under the cap of the top hinge pin. I tapped the base of the handle gently with the rubber mallet. The well-oiled metal popped upward with a soft, almost imperceptible click. I pulled the pin free and slipped it into my pocket. I repeated the exact same motion for the middle hinge and then the bottom hinge. It took me less than 3 minutes. With the pins removed, the heavy deadbolt on the opposite side of the door was rendered entirely useless. It was securely locked into the door frame, but the door itself was no longer attached to the wall. I placed my tools gently on the top step. I gripped the heavy oak door by the handle and the exposed edge, pressing my shoulder against the wood to support its considerable weight. I pulled it backward, carefully sliding it free from the frame, and leaned it quietly against the interior wall of the staircase. The barrier was gone. The hallway was completely open to me. A warm breeze carrying the scent of roasted garlic and expensive perfume drifted into the cold stairwell. I stood in the shadows, entirely hidden from view, looking out into the brightly lit corridor. I could have stepped out right then. I could have walked directly into the kitchen and confronted Vanessa in front of the catering staff. I could have marched out to the patio and interrupted Gordon while he was smoking his imported cigars. But I did not move a single muscle. Patience is the most powerful weapon a man can possess. A poorly timed confrontation would allow them to control the narrative. They would pull me aside, they would whisper frantically, they would try to usher me out the back door, claiming I was having a mental episode. They would minimize the damage and spin the story to save their own reputations. I needed absolute, total public destruction. I needed a moment where escape was physically and socially impossible. I remained in the shadows, listening to the rhythm of the party. I knew exactly how these high society gatherings functioned. Right now, the guests were mingling. They were scattered across the living room, the dining area, and the backyard patio in small fragmented groups. If I struck now, the impact would be diluted. I needed them consolidated. I needed them silent. I needed them to be a captive audience. So I waited. I stood motionless at the top of the basement stairs for over an hour. My legs did not ache. My resolve did not waver. I listened to the arrogant laughter of my son echoing from the living room. I heard him boasting to his corporate bosses about the renovations he was allegedly planning for the property. I heard him claiming credit for the vaulted ceilings and the custom mahogany trim that my late wife Diane and I had designed together. Every lie he told, every boastful claim he made, only added fuel to the fire burning inside my chest. As the evening wore on, the ambient noise in the house began to shift. The string quartet stopped playing their lively background music. The catering staff began moving swiftly through the rooms, softly tapping silver spoons against crystal glasses to capture the attention of the guests. I heard the unmistakable sound of 80 people shuffling from the patio and the dining room, migrating toward the central living space. They were gathering for the speeches. This was the tradition Gordon and Patricia insisted upon at every family event. They needed to be the center of attention. They needed to publicly congratulate themselves on their exquisite taste and their remarkable success. I knew Gordon would not be able to resist making a grand toast to his daughter and his son-in-law, proudly showing off the massive estate he was secretly planning to steal to pay off his own bankruptcy debts. The low murmur of this crowd began to settle into a hushed, expectant silence. I stepped forward slightly, positioning myself just out of sight behind the hallway corner. Through the crack in the doorway leading to the living room, I had a perfect view of the grand staircase. Gordon was standing on the second step, elevating himself above the sea of wealthy guests. He held a glass of premium champagne in his right hand. He was wearing his custom tuxedo, his chest puffed out with unearned pride. Standing directly below him, looking up with expressions of absolute adoration, were Vanessa and Cameron. They looked like royalty presiding over their kingdom. My son looked so proud, so utterly confident in his stolen victory. He truly believed he had outsmarted the world. He believed he had locked his inconvenient, dirty old father away in a dark basement where he could not interfere with this perfect, elegant lie. I took a deep, slow breath. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit. I felt the heavy manila envelope resting securely in the inside pocket of my wool jacket. The envelope containing the legal eviction notice from my attorney, Stewart. My phone rested in my other pocket, fully charged and loaded with the security camera footage that would expose their criminal conspiracy to every single person in the room. The hour of mercy had passed. The silent adjustment was over. It was time for the demolition. I stepped out of the shadows of the hallway and began walking slowly, deliberately, toward the blinding lights of the living room. I stood in the shadow of the hallway, listening to the gentle chime of a silver spoon tapping against a crystal champagne flute. The delicate ringing sound cut through the low murmur of 80 wealthy guests gathered in my living room. The soft, elegant music from the string quartet outside faded away, allowing a heavy, expectant silence to settle over the crowd. I remained perfectly still just out of sight, allowing the grand performance to begin. Gordon stood on the second step of the grand staircase, elevating himself above the sea of designer evening gowns and expensive tuxedos. He held his glass high, his chest puffed out with the unearned pride of a man who believed he had successfully stolen a kingdom. The warm light from the crystal chandelier reflected off his polished shoes and his immaculate suit. He cleared his throat loudly, demanding the absolute attention of the corporate executives, city councilmen, and elite investors who filled my home. Friends and esteemed guests. Gordon began, his voice booming with arrogant confidence. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate more than just an anniversary. We are here to celebrate the future. Look around you at this magnificent home. Look at the vaulted ceilings and the solid oak floors. It takes a remarkable amount of vision and relentless dedication to secure a property of this magnitude in such an exclusive neighborhood. I listened to his words, feeling a cold calm settle deep into my bones. He was praising the craftsmanship of the home I built, with my own 2 hands, while actively trying to steal it from me. Gordon gestured grandly toward my son and my daughter-in-law, who were standing at the foot of the stairs. Cameron and Vanessa looked like absolute royalty. Cameron wore a custom-tailored suit purchased with the money he had secretly siphoned from my emergency credit card. Vanessa beamed brightly, resting her head against my son, acting the part of the perfect, devoted wife. I want to raise a glass to my brilliant daughter and my incredible son-in-law. Gordon continued, his voice echoing off the walls. Cameron has worked tirelessly climbing the corporate ladder, proving that true ambition always yields the greatest rewards. And Vanessa has been his perfect partner, standing by his side as they finally claim their rightful place in the world. They have secured this beautiful new family estate, and I know they have spectacular plans to renovate and modernize every single room. They are the absolute picture of self-made success. The guests murmured in agreement, raising their own crystal glasses in a unified salute. Cameron smiled modestly, bowing his head, as if he were truly humbled by the praise. He was soaking in the admiration of his corporate bosses and his wealthy peers. He was cementing his fake narrative right in front of the very people he desperately wanted to impress. He truly believed his dirty old father was locked away in a dark basement, unable to ruin his flawless high society masquerade. The hour of mercy had completely passed. The time for the demolition had arrived. I stepped out from the shadows of the hallway and walked directly into the blinding light of the main living room. I did not rush. My strides were slow-measured and incredibly deliberate. My polished leather shoes made a solid, commanding sound against the hardwood floor. The woman standing closest to the hallway archway noticed me first. She was wearing a stunning red silk dress and holding a plate of tiny, expensive appetizers. Her polite social smile instantly faded into a look of absolute confusion. She took a step back, lowering her glass as her eyes traveled up and down my tailored Italian wool suit. I was not the confused, frail old man in dirty flannel that Vanessa had described to her friends. I was a towering, imposing figure draped in jet-black wool, moving with the rigid, unyielding posture of a conquering general. The reaction rippled through the room like a heavy stone dropped into a quiet pond. The elegant conversations died out one by one. The guests turned their heads following the gaze of the people next to them, until every single pair of eyes in the room was locked completely on me. The comfortable warmth of the party evaporated instantly, replaced by a sudden, freezing tension. Gordon stopped speaking right in the middle of his grand toast. His mouth hung open slightly, and the arrogant light in his eyes extinguished in a fraction of a second. His hand began to tremble, causing a few drops of his expensive champagne to spill over the rim of his crystal flute and fall onto the wooden stairs. He stared at me as if a ghost had just walked out of the walls. Vanessa let out a sharp, audible gasp, her manicured fingers flying up to cover her mouth. The blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. But it was Cameron whose reaction told the entire story. My son turned his head and saw me standing in the center of the living room, looking immaculate and powerful. The smug, victorious smile vanished from his lips. Pure, unfiltered panic took over his entire body. His mind struggled to process the impossible sight in front of him. He realized the heavy deadbolt on the basement door had not held me. He realized the man standing before him was not the broken, helpless victim he thought he had successfully imprisoned. The carefully constructed illusion of his wealthy elite life was unraveling in real time in front of his bosses and his investors. Cameron lunged forward, pushing past a group of wealthy guests without apologizing. He closed the distance between us in 3 frantic, terrified strides. He reached out with both hands, attempting to grab my arm and forcefully steer me back toward the dark hallway. He wanted to hide me. He wanted to shove me back into the shadows before the damage became irreversible. "Dad, what are you doing?" He hissed, his voice a desperate, trembling whisper meant only for my ears. "You are ruining everything. Get back downstairs right now before I call security and have you removed." He dug his fingers into the sleeve of my custom wool jacket, pulling downward, trying to physically move my body. He expected me to stumble. He expected me to shrink away in fear and obey his frantic commands, just like the weak old man he thought I had become. I did not step back. I did not stumble. I did not flinch. I planted my feet firmly onto the solid hardwood floor I had laid 40 years ago, locking my knees and making my body an immovable object. Cameron pulled again, but it was like trying to move a brick wall. The panic in his eyes turned into raw terror as he realized he had absolutely no physical or psychological power over me anymore. I looked down at his trembling hands clutching the fabric of my sleeve. Then I slowly raised my head and stared directly into his panicked, terrified eyes. The 80 wealthy guests surrounding us held their breath, watching the confrontation unfold in absolute dead silence. You could hear a pin drop in the massive room. "Take your hands off me, Cameron," I said. I did not whisper. I did not shout. I did not need to raise my voice to command the space. I spoke from deep within my chest with a cold, resonant, absolute authority that carried effortlessly across the dead, silent living room, reaching the ears of every single person present. Cameron froze, completely paralyzed by the sheer weight of my voice. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. He slowly released his grip on my jacket and took a small, hesitant step backward, looking around the room at the 80 guests who were now watching him with intense scrutiny. His corporate bosses were staring. Gordon was frozen on the stairs. Vanessa was shaking. I reached up and calmly smoothed the fabric of my sleeve where his fingers had wrinkled the wool. I did not break eye contact with my son. I let the silence stretch out for another long, agonizing moment, allowing the full weight of my presence to crush the remaining oxygen out of the room. The transition of power was absolute and undeniable. I was no longer the guest in their home. I was the master of the estate, stepping back into the light to reclaim exactly what belonged to me. The audience of elite socialites stood completely mesmerized, unable to look away from the unfolding disaster. They had come to celebrate a young, successful power couple moving into a grand new home. Instead, they were about to have front-row seats to the most brutal and spectacular demolition they would ever witness in their entire lives. The silence in the room was so absolute, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the shoulders of every person present. Cameron stood frozen, his hands trembling slightly at his sides as he stared into my eyes. He was waiting for me to scream. He was waiting for the predictable emotional outburst of a betrayed parent, the kind of erratic behavior he could easily dismiss to his audience as senile confusion. He was desperately hoping I would validate the lie he had been feeding them all evening. I gave him absolutely nothing but cold, calculated precision. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored wool jacket, feeling the heavy weight of the manila envelope Stuart had prepared for me. The crisp rustle of the paper sounded like a gunshot in the perfectly quiet room. I held it out, extending my arm slowly until the thick envelope pressed directly against his chest. "Take it, Cameron," I commanded, my voice steady and unwavering. He hesitated, his eyes darting frantically toward Vanessa and then back to the envelope. The arrogant posture he had displayed just moments ago had completely evaporated. Slowly, his shaking fingers reached up and took the packet. "Open it," I said. He tore the seal, breaking the paper with clumsy, frantic movements. He pulled out the thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. His eyes scanned the bold black text printed across the top of the very first page. Notice of eviction and termination of tenancy. All the color that had managed to return to his face instantly drained away, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. "Dad." "What is this?" He choked out, his voice barely a whisper, unable to process the legal reality resting in his hands. "You are kicking us out." Before I even needed to formulate an answer, a man stepped forward from the dense crowd of elite corporate guests. The wealthy onlookers parted instinctively, allowing Stuart to walk smoothly to my side. My longtime lawyer was dressed impeccably, his silver hair catching the ambient light of the crystal chandelier above us. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at my son with an expression of pure professional disgust. "That is a legally binding 30-day notice to vacate the premises," Cameron Stewart announced, his voice projecting with the practiced, commanding authority of a seasoned litigator. "As the sole owner of this property, your father is formally terminating your unauthorized occupation. You and your guests have exactly 30 days to remove your personal belongings and vacate the estate entirely. If you remain on the premises past that strict deadline, you will be removed by local law enforcement for criminal trespassing." A collective, unified gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy onlookers. Whispers erupted instantly among the corporate executives and city councilmen who had just been toasting to my son. The golden boy of their investment firm, the man who had just boasted about owning this massive estate, was being publicly evicted like a common squatter in front of his entire professional network. Vanessa broke the paralysis. She lunged forward, her heavy emerald gown swishing violently around her ankles. Her face was contorted in absolute fury, stripping away every single ounce of the refined high society persona she had spent all evening crafting. "You cannot do this to us!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and piercing, echoing terribly off the vaulted ceilings. "We are your family, Lawrence. We took you in when you were lonely. We are your own flesh and blood. You cannot just throw us out onto the street in front of our friends." Gordon finally found his courage, or perhaps his profound desperation. He stepped down from the grand staircase, puffing his chest out, trying to salvage whatever scrap of authority he thought he still commanded over the room. "Now see here," Lawrence Gordon barked, pointing a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "This is completely unacceptable. You are having an episode. You are clearly confused and disoriented. We are not leaving this house, and I will not allow you to humiliate my daughter and my son-in-law in their own home." I turned my gaze to Gordon. The supposedly wealthy titan of finance looked incredibly small and pathetic when stripped of his stolen leverage. "Your home," I repeated, allowing a sharp, dangerous edge to enter my voice, cutting through his bluster effortlessly. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I did not engage in a shouting match. I did not defend my mental state against his pathetic accusations. You do not argue with pests, you simply turn on the lights and watch them scatter. I tapped the glowing screen, opening the smart home application that controlled the massive 80-inch high-definition television mounted on the wall, directly behind where Gordon was standing. With a single deliberate swipe of my thumb, I mirrored my phone screen directly to the television. The massive screen flashed brilliantly, illuminating the dim edges of the room. The string quartet outside had long since stopped playing, leaving the sudden blast of audio from the television speakers to echo through the massive living room with devastating crystal clarity. The 80 elite guests turned their heads in unison, staring up at the screen. The video began to play. It was the high-definition night vision footage from the hidden camera I had meticulously placed in the bookshelf. There, on the massive display, was Gordon wearing his loose pajamas, holding a crystal decanter of my expensive scotch. His recorded voice echoed through the room, raw and desperate. "I cannot keep living out of suitcases, Vanessa," he said on the recording. "The bank is foreclosing on our estate on Friday. The creditors are freezing my accounts as we speak. My company is completely bankrupt. 30 years of building an empire and it is entirely gone. We have absolutely nothing left." The crowd of investors and corporate partners standing in my living room gasped in absolute undisguised horror. The men who had just been discussing lucrative business deals with Gordon stared at him with sheer revulsion. Gordon stumbled backward against the banister as if he had been physically struck, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. His wealthy facade, his entire social standing was annihilated in a matter of seconds. But the video did not stop. It continued playing relentlessly, exposing the rot at the core of their entire existence. Cameron and Vanessa walked into the frame on the screen. The entire room listened, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the betrayal, as Cameron admitted they were completely broke and living off my charity. They listened as Gordon coldly outlined the plan to find a corrupt medical professional to sign off on a severe cognitive decline diagnosis. They listened as he detailed the plot to file for an emergency conservatorship, transfer the property deed into their names, and lock me away in a state-run facility. Vanessa covered her ears, pressing her hands tightly against the sides of her head as her own recorded voice filled the room. She listened to herself boasting about how she had planted seeds of doubt with the neighbors, establishing a fake history of dementia. She sobbed uncontrollably, sinking toward the floor, as her elite friends whispered in disgust, backing away from her as if she were carrying a highly contagious plague. Then came the final crushing blow, the moment that would seal their social and professional fate forever. The video showed Cameron staring at the floor, contemplating the plot to kidnap and imprison his own father. The 80 guests stood in horrified silence, waiting to hear what the golden boy of the firm would say. "You're right," the recorded version of Cameron said, his voice cold, arrogant, and utterly devoid of empathy. "The house is too big for him anyway. He does not appreciate it. He just sits around taking up space and embarrassing us with his dirty clothes. Besides, he has got one foot in the grave anyway. We might as well take what is ours before the state tries to claim it." The video ended and the television screen went completely black. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet born of pure, absolute shock. No one moved. No one spoke a single word. The corporate executives who had been praising Cameron just moments ago now looked at him with profound, unmasked disgust. A man who would enthusiastically plot to lock his own father in a nursing home, to steal his house, was not a man anyone wanted to trust with their investments or their business. He was professionally ruined. Cameron dropped the manila envelope. It hit the hardwood floor with a soft, pathetic slap. His legs gave out beneath him, and he fell heavily to his knees, his expensive designer suit wrinkling against the wood. He pressed his hands over his face and began to weep. They were loud, pathetic, heaving sobs that echoed tragically in the massive space. "Dad, please." He choked out the words, barely intelligible through his tears. "Please, I am so sorry. I did not mean it. I was desperate. We were drowning." I looked down at the boy I had raised, the boy I had taught to walk, to build, to be an honorable man. He was entirely gone. The creature crying at my feet was nothing but a parasite mourning the loss of its host now that it had been ripped into the light. "You did not mean it," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that made the guests nearest to us shiver. "You meant every single word, Cameron. You planned every single detail. You just did not expect me to be listening." I looked up slowly, sweeping my gaze across the room of horrified guests. The elite socialites, the investors, the city officials. They all stared back at me with a mixture of awe and terror. "The show is over," I announced calmly, my voice cutting through the lingering tension like a blade. "Please locate your coats and exit my property immediately. The hosts will not be taking any more questions tonight." The wealthy guests did not need to be told twice. They moved like a panicked herd of cattle rushing toward the front doors and the coat check. No one offered their sympathies to my son. No one looked at Gordon. The elite socialites simply wanted to escape the blast radius of this spectacular disaster before the debris ruined their own reputations. Within 10 minutes, the massive living room was practically empty. The only sound left was the soft weeping of my daughter-in-law and the heavy breathing of a ruined family. Gordon watched his wealthy friends abandon him. His face twisted into a mask of ugly, desperate rage. The reality of his absolute destruction was closing in on him, but his massive ego simply refused to accept defeat. He had spent his entire life bullying people in corporate boardrooms, and he thought he could bully his way out of my living room. He marched up to me, his face red and sweating, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. "You think you have won, Lawrence?" Gordon spat, his voice echoing sharply in the newly emptied house. "You think a simple piece of paper is going to force us out onto the street? You are an absolute fool. My daughter and your son have been living here for 6 months. They receive mail here. They have legally established residency in this state. You cannot just hand us a 30-day notice and expect us to pack our bags." Cameron looked up from the floor, wiping his eyes. He seemed to grasp onto Gordon's words like a drowning man catching a life preserver. "I am going to hire the most ruthless eviction defense attorneys in this city," Gordon shouted, stepping even closer. "We are going to claim squatters' rights. We will file injunctions. We will request extensions, and we will drag this out in the civil courts for years. You will be dead and buried before a judge ever forces us to leave this property. We will bleed you completely dry in legal fees until you beg us to take the house." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at Gordon, the bankrupt fraud, who thought he could use the law as a weapon against the man who actually built the foundation he was standing on. I did not even bother to answer him. I simply turned my head and looked at Stuart. My old friend stepped forward. Stuart did not raise his voice. He did not match Gordon's frantic, screaming energy. He operated with the lethal precision of a predator who had already cornered its prey. Stuart reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a second folder. This one was much thicker than the eviction notice. He walked directly up to Gordon, and slapped the heavy file onto Gordon's chest, forcing the man to catch it before it fell to the floor. "I highly advise you against making any more legal threats," Gordon Stewart said, his voice chillingly calm, "because the civil courts are the absolute least of your concerns right now. Open the folder." Gordon glared at Stewart, but his hands mechanically obeyed. He opened the thick file. Cameron scrambled up from the floor to look over his father-in-law's shoulder. Vanessa stopped crying and stared in absolute terror. "What you are holding," Stewart explained smoothly, "is a meticulously documented certified banking record. It details exactly $28,000 in fraudulent credit card charges accumulated over the last 6 months. It outlines every single bottle of imported wine, every designer dress, and every luxury catering invoice that your daughter and son-in-law illegally charged to an emergency credit account under Lawrence's name without his legal consent." Cameron let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He knew exactly what those papers meant. He knew the paper trail was completely undeniable and impossible to defend against. In this state, Stewart continued taking a slow step toward the trembling men. That amount of financial theft constitutes severe felony fraud. But it gets much worse for you. Because Lawrence is a senior citizen, the state automatically elevates these crimes to felony financial exploitation of an elder. That carries mandatory prison time. And because you, Gordon, were fully aware of this deception and actively participated in a conspiracy to unlawfully strip an elder of his property, you are legally classified as a co-conspirator. Gordon dropped the folder. The heavy stack of banking documents scattered across the hardwood floor right next to the crystal champagne glasses. His arrogant posture deflated instantly. "You have 2 choices tonight," Stewart announced, projecting his voice so Vanessa and Cameron could hear every single word. "Option A. You and your entire family sign a legally binding waiver of all tenancy rights, all squatter rights, and all claims to this property right here, right now. You agree to pack your belongings and vacate this estate entirely by Monday morning. You never speak to Lawrence again, and you walk away with nothing but the clothes on your backs." Stewart paused, letting the weight of the offer settle heavily over the room. "Or there is option B," Stewart said, his tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Lawrence authorizes me to press immediate felony charges. We hand these fraud logs and the hidden camera footage directly to the district attorney tomorrow morning. Cameron and Vanessa go to prison for a very long time, and you, Gordon, spend the rest of your bankrupt life fighting federal conspiracy charges." Gordon let out a nervous, frantic laugh. He shook his head, looking around the room as if hoping his departed wealthy friends would suddenly return to save him. "You are bluffing," Gordon stammered, his voice cracking. "You would not do that to your own son, Lawrence. You are just trying to scare us. You do not have the stomach to call the police on your own flesh and blood." I did not say a word. I looked at Stewart and gave him a single sharp nod. Stewart did not argue with Gordon. He simply turned around and walked over to the massive front window of the living room. He reached out and pulled the heavy silk curtain back, revealing the view of the driveway and the dark street beyond. "Gordon, look out the window," Stewart commanded. Gordon hesitated, but his profound fear forced him to obey. He walked slowly toward the glass. Cameron and Vanessa followed him, their eyes wide with terror. Patricia let out a horrified shriek when she saw the flashing lights. She clutched her pearl necklace as if the authorities were going to burst through the door and rip it right off her neck. Through the large bay window, the night was no longer pitch black. The entire front yard, the oak trees, and the stone walkway were illuminated by bright flashing red and blue lights. 3 separate police cruisers were parked sideways across the bottom of my driveway, effectively blocking any vehicle from leaving. The officers were not running toward the house. They were simply standing outside, leaning against their cruisers, waiting in the crisp autumn air. "I preemptively called the local precinct an hour ago," Stewart stated clearly, closing the curtain and turning back to face the devastated family. "The chief of police is a very good friend of mine. I told him we might have a hostile situation involving criminal trespassers and active felony fraud. They are waiting for my phone call, Gordon. All I have to do is dial one number, and they will walk through that front door with handcuffs. The illusion was completely shattered. The threats of squatter rights and long civil court battles evaporated into thin air. Gordon realized he was completely outmatched, outsmarted, and outgunned. He had brought a loud voice to a heavily armed legal execution. He looked at his wife, who was trembling with absolute betrayal, finally realizing the depth of his massive failures. Vanessa collapsed onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands, sobbing with loud, ugly gasps. Her beautiful emerald gown looked entirely pathetic now. She knew she was going to lose everything. The high society life, the wealthy friends, the luxurious future she had planned, it was all entirely gone. She was going to be homeless by Monday morning, and she knew it. Cameron fell back onto his knees, picking up the scattered banking documents with shaking hands. He looked at the charges, the undeniable proof of his greed and his betrayal. He looked up at me, his face wet with tears. He was waiting for me to show some sign of mercy. He was waiting for the gentle, forgiving father he had exploited for 6 months to suddenly return and save him from the consequences of his own horrific actions. "Sign the waivers." "Cameron," I said, my voice offering absolutely no comfort, no warmth, and no forgiveness. "Sign the waivers, pack your boxes, and get out of my house." Gordon did not say another word. The bankrupt financier, the man who had ordered me to fetch his dry cleaning and fix his plumbing, walked over to the coffee table like a defeated, broken animal. He picked up the pen Stewart had laid out next to the tenancy waiver documents. His hand shook violently as he signed his name, relinquishing every single right he thought he had to my property. He handed the pen to Vanessa, who signed through her tears without even bothering to read the fine print. Finally, Cameron took the pen. My son looked at the legal document that officially terminated his connection to the estate he had tried to steal. He signed his name, leaving a small tear stain on the heavy paper. Stewart gathered the documents, checking the signatures with clinical precision. He nodded, confirming that the legal trap was fully secured. They had surrendered completely. They had waived all rights and agreed to vacate by Monday morning. The squatter threat was dead. The legal hammer had fallen. They were absolutely, completely ruined. And the absolute best part of the evening was knowing they did not even realize the worst was yet to come. They still believed they were just losing the house. They had absolutely no idea the grand suburban estate they were crying over was already scheduled to be ground into dust. Stewart gathered the signed tenancy waivers and slipped them into his leather briefcase. The crisp sound of the brass latches snapping shut echoed like a judge striking a gavel. The legal trap was completely locked, but Cameron remained on the floor. My son looked up at me with red, swollen eyes and a face stained with tears and absolute desperation. He crawled forward on his knees, dragging his expensive, ruined suit across the hardwood floor. "Dad, please," Cameron begged, his voice cracking into pathetic, high-pitched sobs. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot throw us out into the street. We have absolutely nothing left. Gordon is bankrupt. Vanessa has no income. I have drained every single credit card we own just to keep up this lifestyle. If my firm fires me after what they saw tonight, I will be completely ruined. We have nowhere to go." He reached out and weakly grabbed the hem of my trousers. His fingers were shaking violently. I looked down at him, feeling a profound emptiness. He was not crying because he regretted treating me like garbage. He was not crying because he realized the deep moral depravity of planning to lock his father in a nursing home. He was crying because he had lost the game. He was mourning the death of his unearned luxury. "Dad, I am begging you," Cameron cried, staring up at me with a pathetic, shattered expression. "Keep the money. Keep the bank accounts. We do not want your savings. Just let us keep the house. We can start over. We can take care of you. You love this house, Dad. You built it with Mom. It is our family legacy. Please do not take our home away from us." Vanessa chimed in from the sofa, sobbing loudly into her hands. "Please, Lawrence," she wailed. "We will do anything. We will pay you rent. We will clean the floors. Just let us stay here." I looked at the two of them wallowing in their own pathetic misery. They truly believed that the house was the ultimate prize. They believed that if they could just hold on to the brick and the wood and the vaulted ceilings, they could somehow salvage their elite social standing. They still thought they were negotiating over a piece of residential real estate. They simply could not comprehend the magnitude of the chess game they had lost. I stepped back, forcing Cameron to release his grip on my trousers. I walked slowly across the living room, passing the abandoned crystal champagne flutes and the half-eaten plates of expensive catered food. I stopped in front of the massive bay window overlooking the front yard. The police cruisers had already turned off their flashing lights and rolled away down the street, their presence no longer required now that the eviction waivers were signed. But the driveway was not empty. A heavy commercial flatbed truck had just reversed onto the edge of my pristine manicured lawn. The bright yellow headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the giant oak trees Diane and I had planted 40 years ago. "Come here, Cameron," I commanded, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any pity. "Come look out the window." My son struggled to his feet, stumbling over his own shoes. He walked slowly toward the glass, his face pale and slick with tears. Vanessa and Gordon followed him hesitantly, dragging their feet as if they were walking to the gallows. They stood beside me, peering out into the crisp autumn night. Standing in the center of the front lawn was Mike. The ruthless commercial developer was wearing a bright orange high-visibility jacket over his custom-tailored suit. He was holding a massive steel sledgehammer in his hands. He raised the heavy hammer high above his head and brought it down with a thunderous, rhythmic cracking sound. He was driving two thick wooden posts deep into the soil, right in the middle of the expensive landscaping Vanessa had bragged about all evening. Mike tossed the sledgehammer into the back of his truck. He pulled a massive heavy-gauge metal sign from the flatbed and bolted it directly to the wooden posts. The bright, glaring floodlights of his truck illuminated the bold black and red letters painted across the metal surface. Cameron pressed his hands against the cool glass of the window. His eyes widened in absolute sheer disbelief. He read the massive sign out loud, his voice trembling and weak. "Notice of pending commercial demolition." Vanessa let out a sharp, confused gasp. Gordon leaned forward, squinting his eyes against the glaring lights. "What is that?" Gordon demanded, his voice cracking with panic. "What does that mean, Lawrence? Why is there a commercial demolition sign on the lawn of this estate?" I turned away from the window and faced the three of them. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the absolute terror of the moment to completely saturate their minds. "You still do not understand the foundation you are standing on," I said, keeping my tone even and measured. "You spent the last 6 months coveting the wood and the brick of this house. You wanted the mahogany trim and the vaulted ceilings so you could pretend you were wealthy elites. But you were too arrogant to ever look at the county public records. You were too embarrassed by my career as an engineer to ever ask me about municipal zoning laws." Cameron stared at me, his jaw hanging open. "Dad, what did you do?" he whispered. "I did not just sign your eviction notices this afternoon," I told him, looking directly into his terrified eyes. "I met with Mike out there on the lawn, and I sold him the property. I did not sell him a house, Cameron. I sold him the dirt beneath your feet. This double lot is the absolute last remaining piece of land legally zoned for high-density commercial development in the entire downtown district. I signed a binding accelerated corporate transfer 3 days ago." I paused, letting the cold, hard facts sink deep into their greedy minds. "I sold the property for $3.5 million, I announced, the astronomical number, ringing through the quiet living room like a death knell. "Paid entirely in liquid cash deposited directly into an offshore, irrevocable trust that you will never be able to touch." Vanessa let out a horrific, gut-wrenching scream. She collapsed against the window pane, sliding down the glass until she hit the floor. $3.5 million, she sobbed hysterically, tearing at her own hair. "We had $3.5 million, and we lost it. We lost all of it." Gordon stumbled backward, crashing into a plush armchair. The bankrupt financier clutched his chest, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. He realized the colossal magnitude of his failure. He had plotted to steal a $500,000 house and lock me in a nursing home completely unaware that he was sitting on top of a multi-million-dollar gold mine. His greed had blinded him to the actual value of the prize. Cameron stood frozen in place. He looked out the window at the heavy metal demolition sign and then looked back at me. But the house, he stammered, his brain completely short-circuiting. The master suite, the garden. You cannot let them destroy our home. It is not your home anymore, I replied, stepping closer to him so he could hear the absolute finality in my voice. The moment my pen hit that corporate contract, the residential value of this structure dropped to zero. In exactly 30 days, when your eviction notice expires, a fleet of heavy bulldozers will roll onto this lot. They are going to tear down the vaulted ceilings you bragged about. They are going to rip up the hardwood floors. They are going to smash this entire structure into dust and pour a concrete foundation for a 10-story commercial parking garage. I watched the light completely die in my son's eyes. The crushing reality of his situation finally broke him. He was not just losing his luxurious lifestyle. He was losing the multi-million-dollar inheritance he could have simply waited for if he had just been a decent human being. His impatience, his cruelty, and his extreme arrogance had cost him a fortune that would have secured his family for generations. There is no house to fight over, Cameron, I said, turning my back on him. There is no kingdom for you to rule. You tried to bury me in the basement so you could steal my life. Now you can stand on the sidewalk next month and watch the wrecking ball smash your stolen kingdom into the dirt. I walked away from the window, leaving them to weep in the ruins of their own shattered delusions. The demolition was fully underway, and I did not feel a single ounce of regret. The heavy oak front door swung shut, clicking softly into the frame. The last of the elite socialites had practically sprinted down the driveway, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of Gordon and Patricia. The massive living room, once buzzing with the arrogant laughter of corporate executives, now felt like a hollow tomb. The silence was thick and suffocating, broken only by the ragged, frantic breathing of the 4 people who had tried to bury me alive. Gordon slumped heavily against the mahogany banister. His custom tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap costume. The illusion of his high society dominance had been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Every investor, every city councilman, every corporate partner he had invited tonight had watched the hidden camera footage. They all knew his company was entirely bankrupt. They all knew he was drowning in massive debt. His reputation was incinerated. He was exposed as an absolute fraud, and tomorrow morning his social and professional circles would cut him off completely. Patricia sat on the bottom step of the staircase, shivering uncontrollably, rubbing her bare arms as if the sheer coldness of their reality was physically freezing her blood. Vanessa remained on the floor, her expensive emerald gown pooled around her in a wrinkled, tragic mess. She stared at the scattered banking documents that documented their felony credit card fraud. She realized she had traded a comfortable, safe life for absolute ruin. She was facing 30 days until eviction, criminal charges pending from my lawyer, and a husband whose corporate career was entirely over. There would be no luxury vacations. There would be no high society dinners. There would be a cheap motel if they were lucky, and an absolute mountain of legal fees they could never pay. Cameron pushed himself up from his knees, moving like a man who had suddenly aged 50 years in a single hour. He looked at the walls of the house he had tried to steal. He looked at the vaulted ceilings he had bragged about. He looked back at me, his face pale and completely hollowed out by grief. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer one final pathetic apology, or to beg for a microscopic scrap of mercy. But the words died in his throat. He looked into my eyes and saw absolutely nothing. The father who had bailed him out of every scrape, the man who had silently paid his bills for 3 years, was completely gone. I had become the cold, hard structure he forced me to be. I did not offer them any parting wisdom. I did not deliver a dramatic final speech. The demolition sign planted firmly in the front yard spoke much louder than any words I could ever muster. I turned my back on the weeping, miserable remnants of my family and walked away from the living room. I did not walk toward the master bedroom. I did not need to pack boxes or argue over furniture. The $3.5 million sitting securely in my offshore trust meant I could buy 1,000 mahogany tables if I ever desired them. I walked directly to the small utility closet near the front entrance. I reached inside and pulled out a single faded green canvas duffel bag. I had packed it 3 days ago, right after I signed the commercial transfer documents in Stuart's office. It contained a few changes of comfortable clothes, my shaving kit, and my important personal documents. But the most valuable item in the bag was carefully wrapped in a soft flannel shirt. It was the framed photograph of Diane that Cameron had carelessly tossed into a cardboard box earlier that week. I had replaced the cracked glass. I took her with me, leaving behind the bricks and the mortar, because a home is not made of wood and nails. A home is made of the people who truly loved you. I gripped the handles of the duffel bag and walked out the front door. The cool, crisp autumn air hit my face, feeling incredibly clean and refreshing. I walked down the stone pathway, stepping past the glowing yellow lights of the commercial demolition sign. Cameron and Vanessa stumbled out onto the front porch, shivering in the cold night air. Gordon and Patricia dragged themselves out behind them, leaning against the brick columns like defeated prisoners waiting for their sentence. They watched me walk away, expecting me to climb into my old rusted pickup truck. I walked past the truck. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a heavy set of keys. I pressed a button on the remote fob. Half a block down the street, parked quietly under the soft glow of a streetlight, a massive vehicle roared to life. The deep rumbling purr of a heavy-duty diesel engine vibrated through the quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a brand-new custom-built luxury Class A motorhome. I had purchased it 2 days ago using a massive cash advance provided by Mike the developer. It was a rolling palace, 40 feet of gleaming polished steel and tinted glass, featuring a king-sized bed, a full kitchen, and every modern comfort a retired man could ever desire. I walked down the sidewalk and opened the heavy door of the motorhome. I climbed up the illuminated steps and tossed my duffel bag onto the plush leather passenger seat. I sat down behind the massive steering wheel, adjusting the mirrors. Through the side window, I could see the 4 of them standing on the porch of the doomed estate. They looked so incredibly small, standing there in the cold, stripped of their money, their pride, and their fraudulent power. They were facing imminent homelessness, massive debt, and the absolute destruction of their social lives. I was facing the open road, the Grand Canyon, the coastal highways, and the absolute freedom of a man who had finally cut the dead weight from his life. I did not honk the horn. I did not wave goodbye. I shifted the heavy transmission into gear, released the air brakes, and pressed the accelerator. The massive motorhome pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving my son and his toxic family standing in the shadows to choke on the bitter ashes of their own unrestrained greed. The greatest lesson I learned from this ordeal is that true power does not need to shout, and real wealth cannot be measured by appearances. We often sacrifice our own peace to protect the people we love, hoping our endless generosity will eventually teach them gratitude. But giving everything to someone who only values what they can extract merely turns them into a parasite. Sometimes the most profound act of love you can perform is to stop saving them from themselves and let them face the crushing weight of their own consequences. Dignity is not something you surrender to keep the peace, because it is the solid foundation you stand on when the walls come crashing down. If my journey has resonated with you today, please hit the like button, share your own experiences in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and truth.